Brethren, my heart's desire and prayer to God for Israel is that they might be saved. For there is no difference between the Jew and the Gentile. For the same Lord over all is rich unto all that call upon him. Zola Levitt presents. Considering the times and seasons of our world today, here's Zola Levitt.
Shalom. Hello again. If you watch last week's program, you'll be fascinated again because we have Nehemia Gordon back. He is an Orthodox Jewish man who reads the scriptures and does what they say. Now, what do I mean? Don't all the Jews? No, they don't. Not a Jew, unless he's Messianic and saved, is basically not familiar with Scripture. Jews in Israel don't read end times prophecy, even though they're going to be the middle of it. They don't know the Messiah. They misquote the Torah all the time. They keep laws that are nowhere near Scripture. They have what they call an oral law that supposedly was told to Moses and passed down orally and finally written down, but that's about as good as commentaries that we have in Bibles. You wouldn't live your life according to Schofield or Ryrie or Thompson. You would live your life according to Scripture. Anyway, you'll see what I mean as we talk to him. I was just fascinated with everything this man said. He is really something, a Karaite Jew, Nehemia Gordon. The separation of milk and meat. People know Jews buy this. They won't drink a glass of milk with a meat meal. They separate their dishes. Some even have two dishwashers.
Right. Even in Jerusalem, you go to a restaurant and they'll say on the front, is it a meat restaurant or a milk restaurant? And the two can't mix. So it says in the Torah very clearly, in three places, word for word, I'll read to you from Exodus 23. It says, Lo tevashel gedi b'chalev imo. You shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk. A kid, of course, is a young goat or a young sheep. Yeah. It says three times, word for word, do not boil a kid in its mother's milk. Yeah. So as a Karaite, I ask the question, an ancient Israelite shepherd or farmer hearing this, hearing the Torah read to him every seventh year, as is described in Deuteronomy 31, what would he understand from the commandment, do not boil a kid in its mother's milk? Presumably he'd understand, do not boil a kid in its mother's milk. And especially if it says the same thing three times.
This is the way Babylonians sacrificed, I understand, and Canaanites. It was very inhumane.
It was a Canaanite fertility ritual, is what's been discovered by archaeologists, that it was they would take the firstborn kid and they'd boil it in the milk of its mother, and that was a fertility ritual for the goddess Ishtar or Ashtoreth. The commandment, though, is very clear, do not boil a kid in its mother's milk. And the fact that it says it three times, that's because the people were hearing this. Remember, not everybody had a Bible in their house.
Yes.
To produce a Bible, to produce a copy of the Torah was an immense undertaking. You had to be very rich. You had to slaughter a whole flock of sheep for the hides, produce barrels and barrels of ink. You didn't go to a store and buy a pen. And you had to pay somebody to sit for at least a year to copy it. There's actually law in Deuteronomy 17 that the king has to write for himself a copy of the Torah. Why is that? It takes a king to have the resources to have a copy.
I understand.
So in Deuteronomy 31 it tells us that the way Israel learned the Torah is they heard it read aloud every seventh year.
Okay.
Now if something's being read aloud, repetition is very important. So where do the rabbis get eating meat and milk together from do not boil a kid in its mother's milk? Well, they say that if something is repeated word for word, in the same exact words three times, and it actually has three separate meanings. Because they don't ask the question, what would the ancient shepherd understand? They look at Scripture as a secret code, and only they have the secret method of how to decipher that code. Yeah. So if it says three times word for word, do not boil a kid in its mother's milk, it means three separate things. And there's actually an old rabbinic joke about this, that goes that Moses is up on Mount Sinai, and he's receiving the Torah, and God says to him, Moses, do not boil a kid in its mother's milk. And Moses says, what do you mean by that? Oh, you mean don't eat meat and milk together? Moses, do not boil a kid in its mother's milk. What do you mean by that? Oh, you mean have separate dishes for meat and milk, which of course Orthodox Jews do today. Moses, do not boil a kid in its mother's milk. Oh, you mean wait 6 hours after I eat meat until I'm allowed to eat milk. Again, something Orthodox do. Yeah. God finally says, whatever you want.
Yeah, he gives up. Yeah.
Now, this is a joke that the rabbis tell, but it illustrates a point here that when something is repeated word for word three times in Scripture, the rabbis interpret it as having three separate meanings, as if they're somehow divining what God really meant. Why not just take at face value what God meant? He was very clear about it. He said it three times. So I eat meat and milk together, absolutely no problem. I don't have separate dishes for meat and milk. There's just no reason not to. It's a very interesting thing that Maimonides talks about. He says that Maimonides was the great 12th century rabbinic theologian, and really modern Orthodox Judaism is the religion of Maimonides in many respects. He says that when the future prophets, when prophecy is reestablished and a prophet will come and he tells the rabbis that they've interpreted the law wrong in even the most minor point, that prophet must be executed, because a prophet has no right to contradict the words of the rabbis. The rabbis in rabbinic thought have absolute authority to interpret Scripture.
You don't even read about them in the Scriptures.
Right. I mean, that for me was one of the most amazing things, because I was raised with rabbinic Judaism, and when I actually sat down and started reading I'd read the Torah, but when I sat down and started reading the prophets and the writings, I genuinely, naively expected that I'd be reading about this rabbi and that rabbi, and they're not mentioned anywhere. No. There's no mention of an oral Torah. A basic doctrine of rabbinic Pharisaic Judaism is that there's an oral Torah revealed on Mount Sinai. It's not mentioned anywhere in the entire Hebrew Scripture.
What's about the Sabbath? The rabbis really come down on the Sabbath.
I mean, if you ask most Orthodox rabbinic Jews what the most important laws are, they're going to put the Sabbath up there with the top three.
Yeah.
And the Sabbath is a very important law. It's the sign of the covenant between the Creator and Israel. But they've turned the Sabbath into something completely different. I remember this growing up, that work is forbidden on Sabbath, obviously. So the rabbis ask the question, what is work? And they define work in a very technical legal definition, that there are 39 specific acts that are forbidden. And those acts include grinding grain into flour, and writing with a utensil, writing with a pen, and carrying outside. For example, according to a rabbi, if I put a handkerchief in my pocket and walk outside, I've violated the law. I violated the law of the rabbis.
Because you're carrying.
Because I'm carrying outside. And when the Torah said, do not work on the Sabbath, they say that he meant these 39 specific things. They give a very well-known example that the rabbis give, is that you can't walk outside with the handkerchief, but you could take all the furniture in your house and move it up 3 more stories into the upper part of your house, because you haven't carried it outside. So the irony here is that they have these 39 forms of work, but actually work isn't one of them. In other words, physical labor is not one of the 39 forms of work that the rabbis forbid. And to me as a Karaite, when I say, okay, what is work? I look at the Scripture and I say, how is this word used in the Hebrew Scriptures? And you can see from looking throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, the word labor, in Hebrew melacha, it refers to physical labor, and even more generally to the daily tasks that a person has to carry out during the 6 days of the week. And so to me, when it says do not work 6 days and rest in the 7th, do not do labor on the 7th, what that means is don't do the daily tasks that I'm forced to do during the 6 days of the week. We were talking before about, you asked me about electricity.
Oh, yes.
One of the things the rabbis won't do is they won't turn on and off a light switch on Shabbat. And why not? Most people don't know why. I think most rabbinic Jews do know why, but most people don't. The reason they won't do that is because one of the 39 forms of labor is building. That is, building, constructing a house, constructing a tent. They say, the rabbis say, that when you turn on a light switch, you have constructed a circuit. Right?
Completed an
electric circuit, and that's an act of construction.
Oh my gosh.
And therefore it's forbidden to do that on Shabbat. You can't turn off the light switch because that's tearing down, which is another one of the 39 forms of labor. By the way,
excuse me for smiling. It's almost crazy.
They apply the same law to opening up an umbrella as well.
Oh, I love that.
Because opening up an umbrella is building a tent, according to them. Now, I mean, to me, that common sense tells me that an Israelite farmer hearing the word labor isn't gonna even if, let's say construction is one of the forms of labor, let's even accept that for a moment. What does turning on and off a light switch have to do with construction, and what is opening a tent? Is that really what he's talking about? If he's talking about work and labor, then it can't be something as trivial as going like this.
Pushing an elevator button.
Pushing an elevator button.
But they literally walk 3, 4, 5 flights of stairs rather than push the button in the elevator.
Of course, right. They consider that work on Shabbat.
And Jesus said unto them, Do not be afraid. Go tell my brethren to go into Galilee. There they will see me.
It strengthens our faith to know that Jesus walked on the water and that we can call out to him.
It makes the whole scriptures come to life.
All right, listen, we could talk all day about these foibles, but you grew up with these rabbis and so on.
Right.
Do you have something against it? Or
No, not at all. And I want to emphasize that I'm not saying these things in order to bash the rabbis or put them down. What I am trying to do, though, is most Jews who are trying to follow the law, let's say, out there, are Orthodox Jews who are following these things. When I say I follow Old Testament, most people will say, well, the rabbis do that too, and I have no choice but to explain to them that no, the rabbis don't do that.
And we have the same thing in a way in the Christian community. We have the Presbyterian USA always comes to mind because they recently divested from Israel, a very liberal denomination who took, in front of God and everybody, decided not to support the chosen people in the Promised Land, but to support the other side, the terrorists. And the Anglicans are going the same direction, I understand. Christianity, as I can see it, is divided by people that read the scriptures and do what it says, believe in the Messiah, etc., and bunches of people that do strange customs. And I mentioned Catholics, Mormons, of all sorts out there, and liberal denominations. They roughly pertain to what you're saying. The whole rabbinical thing, they're much greater in number. But the ones who read the scripture, it almost shows on their face that they know what they're talking about. They're sincere in their beliefs. And they've been accused of re-electing the president, by the way, but I think that was just people of common sense of whom they are part.
Okay. There's no question that there are similarities. And one of the similarities you talk about Catholicism is this whole concept of authority. The rabbis have this doctrine I started talking about before, that they have absolute authority on earth to interpret Scripture. And I remember I was presented with this by one of my rabbis who was trying to convince me of the absolute authority of the rabbis. I would come to my rabbis and say, but this interpretation doesn't make sense, and that interpretation doesn't make sense. That's not really what it says. And ultimately, one day, my rabbi sat me down and said, Nehemia, you got to stop this. You have to accept the authority of the rabbis, whether you agree with their interpretation or not. And he's told me a story from the Talmud to illustrate this point. And this is the famous story of Rabbi Eliezer, who was one of the greatest rabbis at the end of the first century. And the story goes that Rabbi Eliezer was debating with all the other rabbis on some small point of rabbinic law. And Rabbi Eliezer had one opinion, all the other rabbis in the academy had another opinion, and Rabbi Eliezer knew he was right, but he couldn't convince them. So the Talmud says that Rabbi Eliezer brought every rational and scriptural argument in the world that he could, and the rabbis weren't convinced. And finally he breaks down and he says, I'm going to prove this through a miracle. And he invokes a miracle and he says, if I'm right, let the river prove it. And they hear this great rumbling and they look outside and there's a river, the river's flowing backwards. And the rabbis admit, this is a miracle.
Yeah.
But they turn to Rabbi Eliezer and they say to him, sorry, Rabbi Eliezer, we don't listen to rivers. He invokes another miracle. He says, if I'm right, let the trees prove it. And there's a miracle with trees flying in the air, being ripped out of the ground. They look at this, they recognize this as a miracle and say, sorry, Rabbi Eliezer, we don't listen to trees. He has a third miracle. He says, if I'm right, let the walls of the academy cave in. And they again recognize this as a genuine miracle. Sorry, Rabbi Eliezer, we don't listen to walls. Okay, valid comeback. Finally, he says, if I'm right, let heaven prove it. And according to the Talmud, a voice came out from heaven and said, why do you dispute with my servant Rabbi Eliezer? He's right in everything that he says. And the rabbis hear this and they recognize this is a heavenly voice, that this is a form of prophecy that's come down. But they say, sorry, Rabbi Eliezer, we don't listen to heaven.
Wow.
And then they quote a verse from Scripture, Deuteronomy